Hi, Sonia. Hi, Daniel.
Hello, hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay, great. Welcome. Hi, Stanley. How are you? Hi, Haman. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. Haman?
Hello?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you properly. How are you?
I'm fine. How is South
Good.
Sudan?
South Sudan is fine.
Are you with Koki?
No, we are on holiday today, so
Oh,
we
I
are
see.
apart from each other.
Thank you so much for joining.
You're welcome. I'm very much interested.
Thank you. Who else is here? Stanley, hi.
Hi, Abby.
How are you?
Good, good. How are you?
I'm good. You're sounding very far. Or is it me who's very far from my
Am I?
laptop? Yeah,
Is that okay?
yeah,
Okay.
sure. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. How is Bangladesh?
It's good. Everything is
But you're
good.
not there, right? You're still there, right? When you're double headed, I don't know where you are now. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Stanley.
How
How
are
are
you?
you? Good, good. Thank you very much.
How's Juba?
Oh, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, it's raining and
How,
today is a holiday, so yeah, we are
ah,
fine. Yeah, 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 yeah.
and and how's my brother Savaki?
Uh, I think he's fine.
I get it.
Yeah, we're not hearing much, so I think he's fine.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
So, Abby,
Yes.
you don't need extra pairs of hands.
Pardon?
You don't need extra pairs of hands.
I do
In
need. Actually, you should record the webinar for me. And then after this, we will see.
Is that the interview?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's actually crazy now. It's
Yeah, I
you
can
know, the
imagine.
beginning of HPC, so there's a lot of requests coming in, but also
Mhm.
a lot of things we have to do as GNT. So it's quite a crazy time now.
Mhm. I can imagine.
Yeah. But all is well. We are managing.
I know you are able, you are capable.
Well, we are trying.
Yeah.
So let's give a few minutes to
Okay.
probably 3-4 minutes, and let's see if more people will join, and then we can start.
Okay.
Hi, Anna. Anna, can you hear me?
Hi, Abby. Sorry, it's a bit difficult for me to mute and unmute, but hi, everybody.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Anna.
Thank you for joining. Hi, Carla.
Hi, this unmuting is weird on our laptops here in Geneva. Hello, everybody.
Uh,
How are you,
Hey,
Abby?
I'm good, Carla.
You
Thank you
good?
for joining.
My
Hi
pleasure.
everyone from Stefano.
Hi, Stefano.
Hi,
Thank you.
Stefano.
Hi.
Hi, Anne.
Hello, Abby.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Thank you for joining. Let's give ourselves 2 minutes. Sonia, are you here now?
Yes,
How are
I can
you?
hear. I'm fine, thank you. What about you?
I'm good. How is Mozambique?
It's good.
Is Javier joining us?
I don't know. He is here in the office, but I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Koki.
Hi, Abby.
Oh, you sound excited. What's up?
Oh, it's a holiday. I'm just the
Oh,
energy is still good. It's a holiday here in South Sudan.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you too for this webinar. Thank you for organizing.
You're welcome. We give ourselves 1 minute and then we'll start.
Did it work, Dorothy?
Okay. So, hi everyone.
Hello.
Hi, Abby.
We will start because we have only 1 hour. Now we have like 55 minutes. And the webinar is quite lengthy. We tried to incorporate all that was required. We understand that you're very busy, so we didn't want to take a lot of time. But we wanted to have this first tape to just discuss about the enhanced humanitarian program cycle approach. So I'll start by introducing myself. I think most, if not all of you know me. My name is Abigail, Abby. I joined the GNC Coordination Help Desk in the beginning of the month, taking over from Angeline, who's in maternity leave, who has done a lot of work on support to the Coordination Help Desk. We are 12 of us, so I will not go around because it will take quite some time, but I do recognize and appreciate everyone who has joined. Also just want to recognize the contributions of other thematic sectors. We have contributions from GBV, from AAP, and also from protection to this webinar. So it's also a consultative process. And also to just say that this is not a technical presentation, so we will not really be going in depth in terms of the technical issues on the enhanced HPC, but it's sort of more of a process-oriented presentation. And the help desk continues being open to receive the technical questions that you may have, and also to point you to the right direction on all aspects of the enhanced HPC process. So just an overview and thinking back of why we have the enhanced humanitarian cycle approach. It's really to look at a very comprehensive and inclusive process. So ensuring that we have all the necessary stakeholders doing joint analysis, needs analysis, and also having a response that is integrated, is multi-sectorial. It's also forward-looking. It focuses on the evolution of the needs, evolution of the humanitarian situation. There's a very strong focus on prioritization, as we will see, and also authoritative. So in terms of really making sure that the needs speak to the situation and also informs the response. So to just reflect why we have the HPC revision, it's around 4 major areas. Number one is to improve the relevance and the effectiveness of the response. So ensuring as a humanitarian community, we are providing the right assistance for the right needs at the right time. To increase the quality and usefulness of the needs analysis. So ensuring that the decisions that we make as a humanitarian community are informed by the needs analysis. There's also a very strong focus on monitoring of needs and results, in addition to monitoring of the processes and activities that we normally do. And also a reflection on the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain commitments and initiatives that we all know, looking at the intersectorial and comprehensive analysis of need. So moving from doing analysis per sector and doing multi-sectorial analysis, risk and vulnerability analysis as well, a very strong focus on accountability to affected population, people-centered analysis, as well as ensuring that the voices of people, of the affected people and own priorities are put into consideration at the planning phase, a localization of the response, intersectorial analysis, also prioritization of the response. In line with the Grand Bargain, also a very strong focus on cash transfer programming and bridging the humanitarian developmental nexus. So What is new in the new HPC process? There are stronger linkages between the needs analysis, the humanitarian needs analysis, as well as the response. So basically the response, the emphasis is to use the change language while developing the response and showing very strong linkages with the needs overview that has been collectively agreed. There's also a very strong focus on the intersectorial nature of needs and response from the beginning of the planning phase, and then this informing the response. And also a better understanding of causes. And with causes, we are talking about both the immediate causes, the chronic and the structural, level of severity, and forward-looking, as we said, looking at the likely evolution of needs to be able to inform a more holistic and effective response. As well, very strong linkages for humanitarian and developmental interventions at the beginning, starting from the beginning of the HPC process. And then in terms of priority groups and geographical locations, so identifying that and formulating result-based strategic objectives. So strategic objectives that speak to the humanitarian outcome that we want to achieve. And the last is the monitoring systems, as we've said before, that looks beyond the process monitoring, activity monitoring, to looking at monitoring of ongoing situation that should be able to inform the response strategy, and also to be able to inform whether we are achieving the desired humanitarian impact. So the 2020 humanitarian needs approach, we've already talked about, and to just reinforce about the jointly agreeing on the scope of the analysis. So moving away from, each sector identifying the scope of analysis differently, to doing that together, and then identifying of the humanitarian consequences or humanitarian conditions that we will see in a later slide what this means, and then looking at their likely evolution and ensuring that selected priority groups as well as the geographical areas, we are identifying the most vulnerable geographical areas, the most vulnerable population groups, but even within that vulnerability, trying to find how the different vulnerable groups are affected by the crisis. We talked about forward-looking, so it's about projection of the current humanitarian needs, but also based on the risks, the vulnerability, and the capacities. And we've already talked about the continuous monitoring. So the structure of the humanitarian needs overview is classified now into 4 sections. There is the summary of the humanitarian needs, which is a summary of the 4 sections. And the first section looks at the crisis impact and the humanitarian consequences. So looking at the context at which the crisis lies, what the impact of the crisis has in dimensions, the humanitarian consequences, the severity of needs and the people in need, as we will see in a later slide, and then synthesis of the humanitarian consequences. Part 2 looks at the risk analysis and the monitoring of the situation and needs, and then the sectorial analysis, the thematic sectorial analysis is part 3 with the relevant annexes in full. We did share the step-by-step practical guide for the HNO and the HRP to all of us, and we will share again with the other relevant materials after the webinar. I'm really advising that we read and internalize this because it's a basis for the entire humanitarian enhanced HPC process. We will go quickly through it. It's divided into 2 sections. The first one is looking at the humanitarian needs overview, and the second one looking at the humanitarian response strategy or the response plan. The first section is looking at the scope and also focusing on the analysis, and the emphasis for the enhanced process is using the joint analytical framework that we will see in a later slide. And joint analytical framework jointly with all the sectors, but also deciding what is the scope analysis, what questions needs to be answered, and with that, what data is needed, what are the indicators, what are the sources of data, and also establishing a timeline and role division for the different agencies and clusters at the beginning. With the having agreed on the first process, moving on to the review and analysis of data and information, and also identifying what is missing in terms of information gaps. So using the primary and the secondary data to be able to do a joint analysis, and then based on the questions that have been formulated in the first stage, identifying what the critical data gaps are, and then conducting a joint assessment, and after that, developing the HNO report or doing the getting the result and then drafting up the analysis. The third section, which is still the HNO, is on the reviewing and approval of what has been done in the second phase. And this is done by the humanitarian country team, where they endorse the answers that have been provided to the three key questions that were formulated in the first step. Also approval of the geographical locations that have been selected, the population groups that have been selected, and also the thematic issues. We talked on the second stage about the need to identify the critical information gaps that would answer the questions that were developed. So seeking endorsement also on the information, the approach that will be able to answer those questions, as well as to monitor the situation and the humanitarian consequences. Linking that to the HRP that starts in phase 4, in step 4, is selecting priority humanitarian consequences to address the needs. And this again is done jointly, and it's reviewing the results of the HNO, and then being able to assess the implications of that, but also deciding within that what population subgroups and what geographical areas should be prioritized in the HRP, and having a very sound rationale for that, and then deciding the most appropriate costing methodology. There's a lot of interest from donors to attend workshops that are looking at costing, and the emphasis is to really have costing methodologies that are evidence-based. So this is also something that we need to put into consideration as we move forward in the enhanced HPC process. The fourth stage is on the analysis of the response options and formulating strategic objectives, which is also done jointly. So based on what has been agreed in step number 4, identifying and analyzing the response options, developing those strategic objectives, and the strategic objectives needs to speak to the desired humanitarian outcomes, and then defining response approach and response modalities. The sixth step is on the monitoring and evaluation framework. The sixth step, is actually seeking endorsement from the humanitarian country team on what has been agreed in step number 5. So approving the strategic objectives, but also seeking endorsement on the monitoring and accountability indicators that have been developed in step number 5. Remember, we talked about the monitoring and evaluation framework that needs to speak to the desired humanitarian outcomes, that needs to show progress in the humanitarian situation, in addition to the response achievement, which is the current practice now. On the 7th stage is formulating the activities and estimate the cost of the response plan. And now this is done each per cluster. So based on the strategic objectives that have been made, The clusters will then identify the cluster objectives and then the activities that will be able to contribute to that, and then developing the projects, uploading them, evidence-based costing on that, and then final write-up of the response plan. So that is a step-by-step process for the enhanced HPC process. Now, we have talked a lot about the changes. So let's look at what are the changes, what was happening before, what is happening now, what is happening in the enhanced HPC process, and what does that mean for us, for nutrition cluster. So the practice before was sectoral analysis. So analysis was done in each of the sectors. Nutrition cluster will do a sectorial analysis. WASH will do a sectorial analysis, same as other clusters. And based on that analysis, will be consolidated and then an overall picture is developed. Now, the emphasis is to do intersectorial analysis from the beginning with more greater depth and breadth, and then showing the relationship between the needs and the causes among those sectors. What that means for us as a nutrition cluster is we need to really understand and internalize the joint intersectorial analysis framework and be able to adapt that in the HNO and really outline the multi-sectorial nature of needs as well as their causes. The second one is on the disaggregation that is often done mostly on gender, and most of the time we will see it's done on a national level. And this is because there's very limited information of how the crisis affects the different groups differently, even within children under 5, how boys and girls are affected, how the different ages are affected among pregnant and lactating women, how they are affected differently. So now the analysis of the different impacts of the crisis for diverse group of people, so by gender, by age, by disability, as well as other diverse characteristics that have been collectively agreed. What means for us as a nutrition cluster is, in addition to gender and age that we have been doing diligently in terms of disaggregation, we also need to incorporate disability at a minimum. And where we do not have data for disability, which will be the case in most places as we start the process, is to use 15% of the population, is to assume 15% of the population where reliable data is not available. So we've already spoken about the disability, limited or no data on disability. Rarely, in most responses, you will find this incorporated from the beginning, from the planning phase. In the enhanced process, we now have a new guidance that I believe we shared before, and again, we will reshare. And the new guidance on disability mainstreaming, which goes beyond just the data disaggregation, and where no data exists, using the 15% international standard. What that means for us as a nutrition cluster is we have to fully utilize the new guidance on disability in the HNO and in the HRP process. We need to start looking at our assessments and making sure that we're also including disability to be able to gate data in subsequent HPC process that will then inform the HNO and the HRPs. What is happening before is accountability. On accountability to affected population, is it seen as an activity? Most of the time, we develop the HNOs and the HRP, and then during the response, we now start to discuss, well, how do we incorporate HRP, AAP in an ongoing response, and really view that as an activity. In the enhanced process, we have to ensure that the perspective of the affected population is reflected in the needs analysis and incorporate that in the HRP using the change language. So that means for us as a nutrition cluster, we have to fully incorporate AP in the HNOs, and it should be based on sound joint analysis as well as the perspective of the people and be reflected in the HRP as well. In terms of the causes, what has been happening is we have been considering the immediate causes and then tailoring that to the response. In the enhanced process, the emphasis is not only to look at the immediate causes, but also look at the structural causes, poverty, unemployment, economic situation, look at the chronic causes, and then be able to, as well as the emerging risks. Remember in the beginning, we talked about risks and vulnerability. So be able to, in addition to the immediate causes, link the acute versus the longer term needs. And this is, we have been talking about for quite a time now, since 2018 GNC meeting, on really doing more on linking the humanitarian development. What that means for us as a nutrition cluster is we need to really understand the holistic drivers, causes, and drivers for malnutrition, as well as the level of severity and the likely evolution of that. And then with that, be able to link in the ongoing developmental interventions. Moving on to monitoring systems. So monitoring systems before focusing on activities and outputs. So most of the time we have a start and then we have an end, agreeing on what needs to be done and then monitoring the response achievement. For now, the monitoring system, in addition to that, must also be able to monitor the changes in the humanitarian situation to make sure that we are continuing to provide the right response for the right people at the right time. And also for the questions that we developed in the beginning in the HNO that seeks to show the desired humanitarian outcome, be able to measure that as well. So be able to have a monitoring system that measures that as well. What that means for us as a nutrition cluster is the monitoring data and the indicators that we collectively collect should be able to inform that joint process, should be able to feed that joint intersectorial monitoring, so that we might also be able to know the changes in the humanitarian situation, the needs, as well as the outcomes. On the prioritization and determination of the people in need, what has been happening is there's been inconsistent and untransparent calculation and prioritization methodologies, different from country to country. For now, the emphasis is ensuring that prioritization of needs is based on calculation of severity using measurable indicators as well as peer methodologies. We have sent communication on this to most of you before. UNICEF as the cluster lead agency has taken this very seriously, and currently we have consultants that have been are working with the 4 UNICEF clusters, including nutrition, to make sure that there is very clear calculations of PIN, but also on the severity. For nutrition cluster, we've done quite well on that, on the PIN and target. But when it comes to severity ranking, talking about the implications, is the severity indicators that we do select needs to have, within that, we also need to have the severity categories that we will see in the next slide. We also need to recognize that the geographical populations that are selected and the population groups are affected differently. So that also needs to come out in the severity ranking. The PIN and the target, we need to be able to have consideration or assumptions on how those estimates were done in a very clear approach. And when it comes to the proportion of the pin that we are targeting, we need to have very sound rationale and evidence of why we are considering the proportion that has been agreed on. The next one is on protection. What has been happening is the protection, the analysis of the 4 areas of responsibilities have been led by the protection cluster. So they have been doing the overall analysis, and this has resulted to insufficient visibilities on the 4 areas of responsibility. In the enhanced process, there is increased analysis and visibilities on the areas of responsibilities, and now each area can now have their own separate pin, calculation, and also subvariety. What that means is the indicators for this have to be agreed at intercluster technical level, and therefore the participation of nutrition cluster on this process is really essential. When we move on to linkages of HNO and HRP, remember when we started, we said, and one of the rationale why the enhanced process is being done is, despite the fact that we have very good HNOs and very good HRPs, most of them do not receive the funding that they are supposed to receive. So HNO served as a loose reference to inform the humanitarian response plan. In the enhanced process, there needs to be direct link between what has been the needs that have been agreed as well as the response plan. So activities in the humanitarian response plan, including the geographical locations and the target group, must address the needs that have been identified in the HNO. So we've already talked about the change language and having very clear links. In terms of prioritization, not only on the basis of severity and need, looking at partner presence, we're looking at who is what, doing what, where, access, which agency is interested to work in which area. So in the enhanced process, there are 3 categories for prioritizing. The first one is on the physical and mental well-being, and this is related to survival. Second one is on the living standards and self-sustenance, as well as capacity. And then talking about the nexus, the last one is on the recovery and the resilience. What this means for us is we have to use these 3 criteria for prioritizing, and we are already receiving questions on nutrition-specific indicators for this, which is still an area that we are discussing. So we've seen the HNO template, and now this is the old HRP template and the new HRP template. Just an emphasis on the new template is we now have the humanitarian consequences prioritized for the response. So what has been, we have the humanitarian consequences in the HNO, remember when we showed the HNO template, and now we have to show what has been prioritized with that and the rationale of that. And then there's the monitoring and accountability in the new template, section 2, looking at monitoring process. There's also AP, indicators and targets, and then the sectorial objective in section 3, the refugee response in section 4, and the relevant needs. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how the templates have been structured and how the information will be input. So in terms of the needs and the response context, this is just showing what has been happening before and what is happening now. So looking at the priorities, at the bigger priorities, and then within that, looking at what we are targeting to do. Moving forward, it's looking at the HRP priorities and the boundaries, so the scope that has been agreed for the response, and within that, thinking about the humanitarian developmental nexus, so the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent and the medium and the midterm, but as well as the long term. So the urgent We talked about the joint intersectoral analysis framework in terms of when we are doing the needs analysis in the HNO. So it is composed of 4 pillars. There is the context section, the events and shock, the impacts, and the humanitarian conditions. So the context is really underpins the environment by which the response is underlaid. And we have quite a number of political, I think it's quite self-explanatory. And then we have the events and shocks, looking at it in 2 folds, both the drivers as well as the underlying causes. And this again leads to the impact of the crisis. And the impact is also on 3 folds: impact on the people, impact on the system and services, and also impact on the humanitarian access. So all this needs to be clearly reflected during the needs analysis. And then the humanitarian conditions or the humanitarian consequences, looking at it in 3 folds: the living standards, the coping mechanism, and the well-being and human rights violation. And then this speaks to the severity of needs that then are classified under 5 categories that we will look at in the next slide. So the first category being none or minimal, the second one meaning stress, level 3 meaning severe, 4 extreme, and 5 catastrophic. So the humanitarian response plan addresses severe, extreme, and catastrophic needs. The next slide, which I will not go in detail from because it's quite a lot of information, but I will try to mention is on the first category, none and minimal, is really looking at building resilience and DRR, supporting disaster risk reduction. And this is where the living standards are acceptable. There's access to all the essential basic needs, and the well-being has very low impact, minimal or low risk of the well-being. The second one is the stress, which is living standards are under stress, and then looking at minimal impact on well-being, as long as the possibility of having incidents or violation of human rights. And this looks at the response objectives under this are still supporting this disaster risk reduction as well as protecting livelihoods. Where the humanitarian assistance kicks in is number 3 on the severe, where the living standards are degrading, inability to meet some basic needs, and also degrading well-being. The response objectives for this is protection of livelihood, as well as preventing and mitigating risk of extreme deterioration and humanitarian conditions. The life-saving and livelihood interventions is on phase number 4, which is extreme, and this is where we have a partial collapse of living standard, partial collapse of access to basic services, as well as livelihood and widespread physical and mental harm. The catastrophic, which is the highest level, which is level 5, is where we have total collapse of the living standard, of the social services, of the coping mechanism. And now this is where there is prevention of widespread death, which is the prioritized response objective. The next slide looks at a little bit of explanations of that. Remember, when we talked about the humanitarian consequences, we said it's threefold. We're looking at the living standards, the coping strategies, as well as the physical and mental well-being and human rights. So within that, the analysis should be able to determine which severity ranking each of those humanitarian profile looks at, ranging from number 1, which is none or minimal, to number 5. We are moving on to now the cross-cutting themes. And we've talked a little bit about integrating of disability, I think in detail, in humanitarian overviews, needs overviews. We've also shared a tip on this, which I assume all of us in the call have received. But if you've not received it, please, we will be sharing it after the webinar. So under the integration of disability is to include persons with disability. We've talked about the 15% where there is no credible data. And then analyzing disability-related dimensions of vulnerability, understanding that even within the disabled person, the impact of the crisis is different. So being able to look at the impact of that in the different groups, and then avoiding to focus solely on need and vulnerability, and looking at the intersectorial nature of that as well. So this is explained in detail in the disability tip sheet. Again, all of us need to really internalize this and be able to use this in the HNOs and HRPs. There's also a tip sheet on protection that we have shared, and again, we will share this. So it's really to emphasize and to know that, OCHA as part of ISC has really committed to placing protection of affected people at the center and front of humanitarian decision making. And this not only includes women and girls, but also boys and men. A little bit more about protection, which is a question that we have been receiving from many countries. There is a difference between mainstreaming protection and an integrated approach to protection. The mainstreaming approach is where we do recognize the centrality of protection and their considerations that are taken by each of the sector during the planning phase on protection. But when it comes to integrated approach, is recognizing that vulnerability is multi-sectorial and jointly agreeing on what indicators need to be collected in each sector with regards to protection, how the analysis will be done, and then what that means in terms of how that can be used to really better understand the protection issues, the humanitarian situations, to be able to have a response, to be able to have a better response. Moving on to GBV. So the first slide, I thought it would be a reminder on the first webinar that we had on GBV, reminding us of what a GBV integrated nutrition service looks like. So GBV is one of centrality of a protection approach, and it's one of the strategy that is used to ensure that the services, the nutrition services that are provided are actually quality, safe, and accessible. On the integration, it's in three folds. The first one is looking at safe and dignified access and use of nutrition services. So making sure that the services that we are providing are located in the right place, in the right distances, but also providing quality nutrition services that are used in the desired way. The ethical nutrition services, meaning that we are providing cultural acceptable nutrition services, but also looking at other issues like prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. Survivor-centered GBV and referral, so making sure that the frontline workers in the nutrition, providing nutrition services are able to identify GBV survivors, they are able to refer them to the right areas for support, but in a survivor-centered way, in a way that is dignified, in a way that the survivors wish to be, in a dignified approach, in simple terms. And this contributes to quality, safe, and accessible nutrition services, as well as reaching the most vulnerable. So with that, how do we then integrate the GBV risk mitigation in HNO and HRPs? So in HNOs, it's really about identifying the risks that are related to nutrition, and the identification of the risks should be done in consultation with the at-risk groups. Identifying the barriers as well, the barriers to access, and also the barriers to use of the nutrition services, and then identifying how those barriers are going to be addressed. That is on the HNO process. Having collectively identified that, this needs to feed into the HRP, so including strategies that are able to address those barriers, and then being able to address the risks that have been identified in the HNO that should contribute to what we've said in the previous slide to enhance safe access and use of the nutrition services. So for GBV, we have Mushumi, whose contacts are here, and I will share again. And she's currently providing a lot of support. Most of the questions that I've been receiving are also point them to the right direction. So please feel free to reach out to her to provide you with all the required GBV risk mitigation in your HNO and your HRP process, or to me, and I will point you in the right direction. For accountability to affected population, I don't know if Carla is on the call, if she would want to take up as a presenter. Carla, are you in the call?
I'd rather you do it, Abby, but I'm here to just say a few words at the end.
Sorry, yes. Hello.
Okay, Carla, should I go on?
Yes, sure. Please go ahead.
So for AAP, so the situation so far in AAP is most countries are not including AAP in HNO, and in HNO meaning from the analysis phase. Some of the countries are including it in part, and most of the countries are also not including it under the nutrition cluster section. So we are looking at 3 primary criteria for HNO review in 2019. And this is on the analysis of the people's satisfaction, on the analysis of the humanitarian needs, and this needs to be based on what has been expressed by the affected population. So a lot of consultation needs to go on that. And then analysis of people preferred channels for communication as well as for sharing information. I think this is the areas nutrition cluster where we are trying to do quite some work on it. But the first 2 sections in terms of the analysis are areas that we really need to work on and to make sure are incorporated in the current HNO, HPC process. So there are recommendations for integrating AAP in the multi-sectorial needs assessment to inform the HNO. So as nutrition cluster coordinators, we have to push for the quality questions on AAP. We will share the list of available questions with the webinar, after the webinar, and the questions should be touching on information sharing. So how access to information and how useful or relevant that information is. In questions on participation and engagement in decision making about assistance, to what extent is the affected population contributing to decisions that are affecting them. Also, existing channels to communicate and providing feedback. So this is existing of feedback mechanisms, but also awareness of them, how they are useful and how they are credible or trusted. Looking at satisfaction with the assistance that we are providing, and also the preferred information based on the needs. There's also looking at the analysis of the priorities, and the analysis of the priorities should be based with consultation with affected groups. So moving away from only having the secondary information that we get through to really ensuring that we are consulting with the affected population and reflecting that in the HNO process, including an analysis of people's preferred channel of communication, analysis of feedback, and also having a meaningful analysis of people's satisfaction. So this is an example. It's a screenshot of what a good AAP looks like, and it's an example from Iraq. Probably a challenge for us is to look at that and be able to see what that incorporates that we can also learn and incorporate in our own HRPs. Lastly, it's performance-based results indicators for improving humanitarian coordination. And this is, we have a set of 7. And within that set of 7, I've highlighted in green what is really relevant for nutrition cluster. The first one is on the joint and impartial and timely needs assessment, and this speaks to the HNO process. Use and coordination of cash-based programming. As we know, GNC is working to have someone to provide guidance note on use of cash in nutrition responses, which has been an ask in several countries. Managing risks more effectively, protection, focus on the protection of risk of vulnerable people in assessments and also in planning and in the response, and increasing the accountability of humanitarian action. So we've talked a lot about the accountability to affected populations. So all this process is actually, in addition to what we talked about in the first slide, the rationale for having the enhanced process. We all received the letter that was shared by Anna on the joint donor letter that was sent to Mr. Mark, as well as the IC principals. And in this letter, there are areas that have been highlighted that we need to work on to make sure that we improve the overall HPC process. And the donor funding for this cycle for HRPs will really be directly linked to the quality of the HPC process, the quality of needs analysis and the quality of planning. So this speaks to how the seriousness of the situation and how really we have to